leader of a country can allow a pandemic to affect so many people and not be held accountable. But in any event, we start out with our all-star panels as we do each week. We have Milton Grimes, the great attorney representing Rodney King. Milton is one of the top trial lawyers in America. John Sweeney. John Sweeney has done tremendous work in all types of litigation, particularly police misconduct. And Vanita Bank, past president of the National Bar Association, a skilled lawyer, cyber security, and she's got all types of degrees, including masters in tax law. So we're just happy to have this all-star panel. But today we're going to start off with another superstar in his own right, a gentleman named Ryan Mears. Ryan Mears is the Marion County prosecutor. The Marion County is Indianapolis, Indiana. Indianapolis is for the people outside of the state, is a city-county type government. And Ryan was selected to serve as prosecutor last October of 2019. And the reason I admire him so much is that Ryan recognized some disparity in our criminal justice system right away. And he did something unusual. He basically decided not to prosecute low-level marijuana users, which was a dramatic effect in our community. In Indianapolis, for example, you cannot be a police officer if you have a marijuana conviction. And now a lot of young men and women can become police officers. And also, it affected people's ability to get jobs. And so we're very happy about that. But more importantly, he had worked hard to make sure that they had a diversified staff at the prosecutor's office. And the reason I have him on here today is that he's done something extraordinary with the grand jury process. Since he's been in office, the controversial cases that you've seen in Indianapolis about police officer misconduct, he's ordered prompt investigation, and he's come up with good resolution. We've had indictments, and so we've seen some wonderful job by the prosecutor, and he's becoming probably our most popular politician because people in the community recognize when somebody's doing an outstanding job. Ryan Mears, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing very well. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on the show. We have a lot of issues, both particularly nationally, that has changed the course of our country. You know, we've had mass riots and protesting. And so what I want to talk to you about today to start off with is that we saw recently that in the situation down in Louisville, Kentucky, involving Breonna Taylor in different cities, they're talking about the grand jury process. Could you briefly explain to our audience what is the purpose of a grand jury and what is it?
Well, the grand jury is just members of the community, and it depends on the jurisdiction. Here in the state of Indiana, it's 6 random members of the community, and they are selected the same way that you would any jury panel. So it's the folks who are registered to vote, who are in the BMV system. Those are kind of your pool of applicants who could potentially serve on a grand jury. They're randomly asked to come in, and then they are seated to hear a particular case or cases. And then once you get into the grand jury process, I think the biggest difference is the prosecutor presents all the evidence. So there's no defense attorney there. There's no defense attorney to make any comments or perhaps cross-examine witnesses. It really is a fact-finding mission where the prosecutor brings in witnesses, brings in evidence, and says, please tell us what happened. The prosecutor's role in that is to facilitate the discovery of evidence and make sure the appropriate witnesses are presented, that the physical evidence or any video, all those things that grand jury has access to, but the prosecutor is not supposed to argue one way or another. It's ultimately up to the grand jury to make the decision as to whether or not charges should be filed. I think a lot of people think with the grand jury that it's a determination on guilt or innocence, and it's not. It's just does probable cause exist that a crime occurred? And I think the important thing about the grand jury as well is it's an investigative body. So if the grand jury chose to, they could say, we would like to hear from additional witnesses. We would like to see this piece of evidence before we make a decision. And that would be totally appropriate.
Okay, now, as part of this grand jury process, does the prosecutor, do they have subpoena power where they can interview witnesses in advance, take statements, collect evidence? And what type of evidence do they typically collect, particularly in a police action shooting?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the great things about the grand jury process is you do have that subpoena power prior to a case being filed. So if you wanted to subpoena any sort of records, let's say you wanted to subpoena disciplinary records of a police officer, you could do that. If you wanted to request video and you wanted to subpoena video evidence because there are surveillance cameras in the area that captured an incident, you could do that. So the subpoena power that comes with the grand jury is incredibly powerful and allows a grand jury usually to have access to pretty good information prior to a criminal case being filed, which is what you want because you want people making decisions based on all of the information's out there and that is available to people. The other thing about the grand jury process is it's not an invitation, it's an obligation. So if you are asked to give a statement pursuant to one of those subpoenas, a grand jury subpoena, you have no right to say, I'm not doing it. Now, if you're a defendant, you have an absolute, or the target of the grand jury, you have an absolute right to invoke your Fifth Amendment right. But if you're just a witness who's a part of the process, who maybe has information or saw something, you have an obligation to come in and testify. And if you don't, then you can be found in contempt of court.
Well, what about police officer in the McGarrity case? One of the concerns that I had, because I've litigated these cases for my professional career, is that police officers are given special protections. Like at one point in time, when police action shooting occurred, like in our city, they would take a videotape statement. They always give them these warnings and et cetera, and that say that the statements you use can't be used for prosecution against you. How does that work today, the McGarrity type issues?
Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges associated with anytime you're dealing with the police officer cases, and police officers will oftentimes, as part of their job, be compelled to give statements as to what happened during an administrative proceeding. The prosecutor and the grand jury doesn't necessarily or never has access to those statements. So there's statements out there that someone who potentially fired a gun that they made that the prosecutor doesn't have access to, which puts the prosecutor and the grand jury in a tough position. One of the things that we do, though, is we give everybody the opportunity to talk, but I think in some jurisdictions the prosecutor's office will sometimes extend immunity to witnesses and police officers and say, we'll give you basically an opportunity to tell us what happened pursuant to an immunity agreement, meaning that it'll never be used against you, but it'll give us a better idea of what happens. I know that happens in a lot of jurisdictions, but that's something that we do not do. If a police officer wants to come in and give a statement, they're going to be treated like everybody else. They're going to take the same oath. It's the same standard. Everybody's going to be held to the same obligation, and that obligation is to tell us the truth of it and about what happened. And so, I think sometimes prosecutors potentially run into some issues when they make that decision. Hey, we're going to give a police officer immunity to tell us what happened. But if that doesn't necessarily match up with the physical evidence or the video or other people's accounts, you can't use that against the officer. And I think that creates an impression amongst the public that there's a double standard.
Well, one of the things that I was impressed with is that in our community, everybody now agrees that you've been fair to both sides. They like what you're doing. They really admire your action. But there's something in particular that I think is important and relevant to our conversation today. We saw some police officer beat up some ladies right on Market Street in Pennsylvania. And I was impressed with the swiftness of the grand jury process and indictment. Tell us how you're able to go from the investigation to a quick indictment, and why are you able to do that so fast here in Indianapolis? I was curious.
Well, in part of that case, I think it's important to remember it was on video and it was brought to the public's attention because the news media filmed it, and so when you have a situation like that, that certainly helps the timeline because you have a pretty clear picture of what took place. I think anytime you're dealing with these types of incidents, you need to act swiftly and quickly. Because if you don't, I think people in the community begin to think, well, hey, is the cover up in, or are people just going to brush this aside or hope that we forget about it? And so I think it's important to always take decisive actions in these types of cases and get things moving so that we can get these matters in front of a grand jury or make a charging decision, and then the public knows what's going on and what's the status of the investigation. I think the biggest disservice you do is when you don't inform the public of what's going on, or you take a long time to make a decision. I think people think that it's what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and you should be able to tell us that sooner rather than later.
Hey, okay, my all-star panel, do you have any questions for our prosecutor?
I do. I have a question for Ryan. Ryan, this is John Sweeney out in Los Angeles. Police unions are very powerful. How do you navigate the very delicate act of not offending a police union, yet investigating police officers with an eye on prosecution? Because as we know, if you became known as a prosecutor who goes after police officers, they would run somebody against you in the next election. And so my question is, how do you navigate that?
And I think they probably will. I think the most important thing for me, though, is I think the police union, the police department, and the community needs to understand that the prosecutor's office is independent and that we're going to make decisions independent of the police union. You know, the police union is looking out for the 1,600 officers that they represent. My obligation is to the entire community and to make sure everybody's treated fairly. And that includes the officers as well. And so right there, you sometimes have competing interests or differences of opinion. I think it's important that we remain respectful of one another and respect each other's viewpoints. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we are treating everybody fairly and we're doing what's in the best interest of the community. And sometimes that means we're going to have to hold police officers accountable. I understand currently in Marion County, there's probably a lot of people who disagree with the decision. But I think it's important that everybody understand the process that we used is the same process that has been used in other police shootings in this county, where officers were cleared or they were not criminally indicted. And law enforcement's response to that was, well, you need to trust the process. The grand jury looked at it, they cleared him, so everything must be okay. Well, that if you're going to say that in other situations, then if the grand jury comes back and indicts someone, I think it's only fair to say they went through the criminal justice process and members of our community thought their actions crossed the line and that they need to be held accountable. And so as long as there's not that double standard, I certainly don't have an issue, but there is a little bit of friction between the prosecutor's office and the FOP and the police department when you make these decisions. But everybody has to understand that we are going to be an independent entity and we're going to fairly apply the facts to the law. And when that happens, if an indictment's appropriate, we're going to move forward. If it's not, then we certainly have no problem with either a no bill through the grand jury or clearing the officers outright.
I really applaud you because a lot of prosecutors across the country talk that talk, but at the end of the day, very few police officers are prosecuted.
Ryan?
Yes.
Good morning. Am I on, Nate?
Yes, Milton. Go ahead, sir.
May I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Please.
Good morning, Ryan. Milton Grimes out here with Los Angeles, keeping my eye on John Sweeney. Somebody have to watch him out. You agree that you depend on the police in your work, right? They work hand in hand with you as your agent?
Correct. Yes.
Would you agree that it's common sense for the public to feel a little better about an investigation of the police department or a police officer if there was an independent agency that was taking cases involving the police to the grand jury to assure them more that there is no impropriety or favoritism being done?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I think if you look at President Obama's Commission on 21st Century Policing, that was their number one recommendation on use of force issues is it has to be an independent entity investigating the officers. You know, I don't think they necessarily go in with the attitude of, hey, we need to try to clear this officer. But I do think that's where their sympathies lie. And I think sometimes they fall into the trap of not critically analyzing conduct, and they're not evaluating, they're rationalizing, and they do a disservice to the officers in the community when they do that. And so independence to me is one of the most important things. And that, for candidly, as a prosecutor, that's one of the biggest challenges we face is, you know, when we need evidence and we need witness statements to take place, we have to rely on the police department to do those things for us. It would be a much better process if there was an independent agency handling those things, who didn't report to the same chief and who had a level of independence, and would probably improve the working relationship for everybody involved. I totally agree.
Okay.
Attorney Banks, you have any questions? Did we lose Attorney Banks? Okay.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm sorry. My phone was momentarily on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
I do not have a question. And Ryan, I want to thank you for your leadership in Marion County. And I just wanted to echo your comments regarding the importance that these decisions be made swiftly and decisively. And that's so critical in order to maintain the trust of the community. And by contrast, we know that that didn't happen in Breonna Taylor's case. She was killed on March 13th of this year, and it's been over 6 months, and justice still has not been done. The police officer, one police officer, was not formally fired until June. The other 2, as you know, have been placed on administrative leave. It's my understanding that a grand jury has now been convened and may be scheduled, from what I've read, to begin its deliberations next week. But 6 months is a long time for this investigation to take place. And it's engendered a lot of distrust within the local community in Louisville.
And I think that as a prosecutor, that's something you always have to be mindful of. And the public makes this point, and it's a fair point. The law is not going to change in those 6 months, and the facts aren't going to change in those 6 months. So you need to make a decision. and I think that's why it's incumbent upon everybody to make sure that we pursue justice. You certainly don't want to overlook facts or make a rush to judgment. But you do get to a point where what happened is what happened, and the law is not going to change. And so let's begin this exercise of applying the law to this specific set of facts.
Okay, now, producer, let's take a caller real quickly on the line. We have a caller, have a question for us.
Yes, how you doing, Brother Nate? And
how you doing?
Grimes and Adams. I appreciate taking time. I'll be very brief because I thoroughly, whenever you are up for re-election, Mr. Mears, Attorney Mears, I would definitely voting for you. I appreciate your leadership. And I don't smoke, but I understand from Harvard and everyone's research about marijuana arrests and convictions and stuff like that. I appreciate when you did that against Curtis Hill and others of fervor. And then I just read the article the other day about you saying that they need to get rid of the monetary penalties for suspended licenses. That is basically a poor tax, or a tax for people who cannot pay. I appreciate that too. I think people have overlooked that. That's a critical problem, because my license doesn't have a problem, but I've heard many others that have had a problem with that suspension fine and stuff like that. So appreciate you putting those at the forefront. It's very progressive, and we appreciate that. I just had a question for you, Attorney Mears. We saw the Curtis Flowers case now finally being dismissed down in Mississippi after trying this man who was innocent, trying to try him 6 times. The prosecutor using all those savory tactics, bastion challenges and things like that to omit black jurors from the jury pool. We were kind of shocked that the Supreme Court ruled for Flowers. Funny that Clarence Thomas ruled against him. It's just a shame. But that didn't stop the ruling from the Supreme Court that allowed that to go forward. As a prosecutor, how do you view what I would call Norris versus Alabama and Powell versus Alabama, which is having equal protection and a jury of your peers and things like that? How do you all truly view someone having a jury of their peers? Because I don't think the public really understands how deep and what that really means and how it has affected Black folks in the judicial system over the years. I'll just see your answer up here. Thanks, Nate.
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have in the criminal justice system right now is making sure that our jury pool is a fair representation of the public at large. And one of the things that we saw in our jury pools is President Obama did a great job of registering people to vote, getting them on the rolls that would allow them to be notified of, hey, we need people to serve as jurors. But one of the challenges that we have is when individuals maybe are younger and more transient and don't stay at the same address long enough, or individuals who are from lower income areas where they don't have that stability, they don't get that notice for jury service, or we have a hard time locating them to get them notified that, hey, you can be a part of this process as a juror. And so that's a challenge that we've had for a while now that we're trying to address. I'm particularly concerned about it during the pandemic as we start doing more jury trials. What is that going to look like from a jury pool perspective in terms of who's going to be willing to come down to the city county building or traffic court? It's very appropriate that we have Mr. Lee here on the line because he had a civil case where he challenged a jury selection and won on appeal in terms of making sure that everybody's rights were protected, and that's a case that actually we used to teach the prosecutors, and Mr. Lee was, I think, the attorney at trial and on the appellate level on a civil case that got reversed. So it's a huge challenge, and it's something that we always have to be mindful of. And a lot of it comes back to that selection process and what we're going to use to ask people to come in. But if you are an African American and you look at the jury pool and 98% of the people are white, that's probably going to maybe make people feel a certain way about things. And I don't think that's I don't disagree with that perspective. And so what can we do to make sure that we're capturing our entire community? And Mr. Lee's very active in the bar and does a good job on the legal side of things. Maybe he might have a better answer than me.
Yes, the case you're talking about, Ashburner versus Byron Rumpkin, what people didn't know, Imhotep, is that Ashburner was a white female. She was a white client of mine. And the defense lawyer struck the 2 Black jurors in the jury pool. Out of 18 jurors, only 2 were African Americans, and he struck them. And he said that the Batson case, which was 1986, didn't apply because the plaintiff was white. We said, no. You take away the rights of citizens of the community when you strike or exclude Blacks from jury service. We pay taxes, we have bills, we have jobs, so we have a right to serve. And that's what the case was all about. Well, thank you, Ms. Imhotep. Now, the next caller, William, we'll take this call real quick. William, you have a question for us?
Yes, I do, Mr. Lee. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Can you speak up a little bit louder, sir?
Yeah, I was just wondering why the United States is trying to push marijuana products, and as much as it's a man-altering drug also, And since it's a man-altering drug, why are the country trying to legitimize the use of this particular drug? People may say I'm meddling, but it also can endanger the lives of.
Hey, William, could you speak into the phone a little bit louder? I can't hear you, sir, very well. I want to hear your question because it sounds like it's very interesting.
The question is, since marijuana is a man-altering drug, like all the rest of them, and alcohol, I was just wondering why are the United States trying to legitimize the use of this product in as much as it could cause just as many problems as alcohol and the rest of the drugs.
So your comment is that alcohol is probably worse than marijuana? Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, I was thinking that the marijuana use is just as dangerous as the use of alcohol and the rest of the man-altering drugs. Why are the United States trying to legitimize that use of this product?
Okay. Anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective too, that for me, this isn't an issue of legitimacy or illegitimacy. When I think it's when you pass a law, it might look okay on its face, but it's how that law is applied. And in this case, it was applied in a way that disproportionately impacted people of color at really startling rates. And in my view, violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. And so when you have a system that's set up where 60 to 70% of the individuals who end up in the criminal justice system are people of color, and then you look at who's ultimately using marijuana, and then you compare which the usage of rate, Caucasian, African American. If you look at their usage rates, and then you look at who ends up in the criminal justice system, I mean, those numbers were not even close to compatible. So to me, that was an issue of how this law is being applied is just fundamentally unfair.
Yeah. So one more question. No? And in regard to the United States also is building bigger and better prisons, and they need they need the to beat up the eyes and the rest of us to fill those drugs, fill the prisons. Isn't that kind of productive for the black man?
I didn't hear the question. Did you hear it, Ryan?
I did not.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. I didn't hear your question, sir.
Let me reiterate.
Yeah,
I'm saying that since the United States is building bigger and better prisons, isn't it kind of productive for the black man to be using that product? Since they are going to beat up your ass, and they can get around the legitimacy, beat up your ass and the rest of the problem that it caused, to incarcerate the black man from using that product.
I apologize. I didn't hear him. Did you hear him?
I apologize. I couldn't hear either.
Okay. I apologize, Ms. Williams. I just didn't hear your question. So it may be your connection or something, but here's where we are. Here's one of my concerns, Ryan, and I've been doing this a long time. This is not your case, but as a general idea, Attorney Banks made a really good point. We have a 6 months delay in the process. The police department would have access to evidence for 6 months. The defendants, police officers, all have lawyers. They're able to meet and converse. And the defense in this case would always be fear of their life or self-defense. It's very simple, pretty basic. Now, would that cause you to have any concern to delay the process for 6 months? I'm trying to figure out what would change in evidence in a 6 month time period that will cause such a significant delay. I'm just baffled because Attorney Banks made this point, and I've been concerned about that as I watched the people down in Louisville, Kentucky protests, and even at the Kentucky Derby, and they're upset about it. And then I saw an innocent man get shot and killed. It brought out different groups of people, all because we have this significant delay. So, but my concern is that now that we had this delay, it appears to me that it prejudiced the ability to get the true facts in the case.
And I think everybody shares that same concern. The one thing that I will say too, and I think it goes back to one of the earlier points the panelists made, is the prosecutor oftentimes is dependent upon law enforcement to do certain things, and it is sometimes challenging for law enforcement to maybe do some of the things that the prosecutor is requesting when you are asking uncomfortable questions or gathering facts that may potentially not look great for the police department. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what happened, but that can also cause delays. And I think it just reemphasizes the point and the importance of having independent outside investigators handle that, because you don't have those relationships. You're not represented by the same union. You do have that degree of independence. And when you're independent, I think you have a tendency to move quicker than if you are doing something when you are investigating your coworker and your friend in some cases. And I think that could potentially sometimes lead to the delay. But I hope that once everybody gets the information, they move quickly, because in these types of cases, there as I understand it, there might be two competing legal principles. Well, that's fine, but that has nothing to do with the facts. And once the facts are gathered, you need to make a decision.
Attorney Sweeney, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, Ryan, recently you made the decision to not prosecute 41 arrestees for nonviolent protestations in downtown Indianapolis. My question is, did you get any pushback, blowback from either the police department or the union for your decision?
Yes, so the head of the FOP sent me a letter saying that I needed to immediately charge those individuals, and I was doing a disservice to the community. And we certainly had some difficult conversations with our law enforcement partners on why we made those choices. That to me, I was surprised by people's reaction, because I think it's a pretty uncontroversial position to take, that people who are not actually committing crimes should not be arrested and charged with crimes. And if you're exercising your constitutional right to protest, you're not doing anything illegal. And so we did receive some pushback, but I've never felt more proud of the law, in the sense that when people are coming out and protesting the criminal justice system, what greater message can we send to the people that we are going to use the law and the criminal justice system to protect you, and say, no, your rights are absolutely valid, and we're going to uphold and protect those rights. And so we definitely had a difference of opinion on those particular areas. But I will also point out that after we made those decisions, IMPD stopped arresting people, and we had no more violence in our city.
No, we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, Ryan, about the power of the police union, especially out here in LA. There are a couple of cases, one in particular I was involved in, where the DA's office has not decided, even after 5 officers who killed this woman were fired from their job. They have not decided whether to prosecute these officers yet after 5 years. But my bigger question is there anything that can be done in your eyes to separate this power of this almighty union from the district attorney office?
Well, I think I'm fortunate here in Indianapolis that there is that disconnect from the prosecutor's office and the union. And, part of that is just an intentional choice that I made. Is, I understand the union has a very important job, and I respect what they do. But again, we have different goals and objectives here. And so, I think a lot of it also comes down to the collective bargaining that the mayor and the council, how much power are you willing to give the union, and how much power are you going to give people in your collective bargaining as people negotiate the process for disciplinary actions, for officer removal? What's that process going to look like? How are you going to evaluate excessive force claims? And so I think part of it starts with that initial collective bargaining conversation in terms of how those investigations are going to be begin, and how officers' conduct is going to be evaluated. And so I think that's a really, really important part or an important piece of this conversation. I know that's something that our community is currently going through, is what should the new police agreement look like? What role should the citizens have in overseeing their police department in terms of excessive force? How are those matters going to be referred to the prosecutor's office? I think those things are all important parts of the collective bargaining process. But I also think it's important that the prosecutor's office publicly state, police union, I don't want your money. I'm not interested in your endorsement, because there are going to be times when we are on the opposite end of things. And that's okay. That's the way this process is designed. But everybody needs to be clear from the beginning that the allegiance is to the community and the challenges that we face. And we want to work with the police department, but we also understand that our job is we're going to have to hold police officers accountable from time to time.
Attorney Banks, you have a question?
Yes, we've seen legislation introduced in the wake of Breonna Taylor's death involving no-knock warrants. The mayor of Louisville immediately suspended no-knock warrants. We've seen the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which would ban no-knock warrants. The Justice for Breonna Taylor Act and Breonna's Law in Louisville, where the city council voted to ban no-knock search warrants, and that all officers must wear body cameras and have them turned on before serving a warrant. And so, Ryan, I was interested in what is the policy on no-knock warrants in Marion County?
IMPD recently banned those as well to get rid of the no-knock warrants. They were already disfavored here in Indiana. There was a court case a couple of years ago that really restricted the scope and use of no-knock warrants. And then IMPD recently announced that they're not going to do them at all, which I 100% support. It not only puts the people in the home in danger, it puts the officers in danger because people have no idea what's about to take place, what's going on. And so there needs to be that announcement of police presence. And, there might be times when someone's able to flush some drugs down the toilet, and that's sometimes a concern. But when you're talking about loss of life and putting people's lives at risk, I think we should always err on the side of protecting life, both of the officers and the people inside the residence.
Thank you.
I'm not aware of any case we've had with no-knock warrants here in Indianapolis. I was just thinking about that all the years. Maybe we've had that, but I've never seen that in actual practice.
They were used.
No,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ron. No, please, go ahead.
Yeah, they were used. So in Indiana law required, you had to basically justify why you thought you needed a no-knock warrant. You had to write that into the warrant. And so you would have to say that there's prior instances of violence against law enforcement, or you knew specifically in this particular room, a confidential informant knew there's handguns or something that would potentially justify the use of a no-knock warrant. The judges started pushing back on that request pretty significantly here in the last couple of years, and IMPD just gradually kind of faded back from asking or requesting those types of warrants, just because there's a bit of skepticism from the judiciary, and then the requirements became somewhat more burdensome in terms to justify them. So they did take place, but they did not take place all the time. And like I said, the judges did a good job of pushing back and saying you really need a no-knock under these circumstances.
Milton?
It's probably more of anyway, my own feelings about it. I mean, it creates such a potential for danger and for a shootout if somebody busts in your door. Nathaniel Lee, for example, midnight or later, and you are asleep, and all you hear is that crash of your door, and you have your home protection nearby, as this Mr. Walker, I think his name, had, and he shot an officer in the thigh, and then they unloaded with a barrage of bullets. That's what breaking in someone's home that time of night with a loud bust invites. So I think when you go through a no-knock warrant service, you have to take all types of precaution. I don't think they had early intelligence in this case. and that the person they were looking for, who supposedly had drugs shipped to this woman's apartment, she had put him out 6 or 7 months earlier. It did not appear that they had fresh information to warrant this no-knock entry, and all kinds of errors were made that they tried to cover up for, lied about. That's the negative part of the no-knock warrant. So it endangers people. It just is room for error too much. And I don't see the need for it ordinarily, unless you got somebody's life at stake in there or some child in danger and then you got to go in immediately like that. What's the need?
Let's get a caller perspective. Caller, you have a question for us?
Yes, I have a comment more than a question, but I'm glad to see such a program as this, Attorney Nate. I've noticed in terms of just looking over the landscape, particularly in the last few months, there is an agreement coming, if we let it come, on the part of the various parties concerned about the community, and particularly would like to give the Marion County prosecutor high marks. This past Thursday in Marion County, the police budget was entertained, so to speak, and you had various voices about that budget. But I see the possibility of the entire community coming together with the prosecutor's office, the FOP police union, the IMPD police department, as well as community members coming together to come to a convergence, so to speak, about the best ways to move forward. I think we're at a point in history, and if we take advantage of that point, a lot of good can be accomplished.
Okay, Ryan, I guess that's directed to you.
And I appreciate those comments, and I really hope that everybody sees this as an opportunity for us to view city county budgets as an opportunity to invest in our community, and what can we do to have the biggest impact on public safety and to help our community. And I hope no one loses sight of that conversation as we work through this process with the budget. Our budget's remaining flat. It's not going up, but one of the things that I thought was important is we need to take a look at how we allocate those resources to best serve the community. So 2 things that we're doing is, number one, we're starting a conviction review unit to look at past convictions, to make sure that those convictions are based on nothing more than the facts in the law, and not prejudice or bad science or other things that may have potentially occurred. And the second part of it is, if we're all going to sit here, and I think most people would agree, systematic racism in the criminal justice system exists, it's a problem and a challenge, then we also need to do a better job on modifications of sentences and making sure that people's sentence reflects what actually happened and not based on other things. Because unfortunately, we have learned that people in our system, the criminal justice system, have sometimes been treated unfairly. And that treatment was sometimes unfair because of the color of one's skin. And so we need to proactively address those issues and challenges as we sit back and acknowledge, hey, there were some systematic failures that took place. What can we do to proactively address it? And again, I think it goes back to that central question of what can we do with those resources to best serve the community. And I hope when people think of the prosecutor's office, they think they're doing everything in their power to help our community, to make our community a better place. And I think that'll lead to a safer community if people have confidence in the criminal justice system and how we adjudicate things. But the question always needs to be, how can we have the biggest impact on the community with this money?
Attorney Sweeney?
We started out, Ryan, talking about the grand jury process, and one of your cases received a lot of publicity back there. The prosecution of two police officers for assaulting some protesters during the recent protest in Indianapolis over the George Floyd killings. The officers are Jonathan Horlock and Nathaniel Schwarrecker. Can you give us, to the extent that you can talk about it, can you give us an update on where that case is?
So we're just in the preliminary part of that case. So when that case was filed, we were still very much impacted by COVID in terms of our ability to conduct anything more than an initial hearing. So we are in the early stages of that case. Both of those individuals posted bonds, so they are out of custody. And so because of that, they're even kind of pushed a little bit further back. So I don't anticipate much movement on that case anytime in the near future, just because we're trying to work through the backlog of individuals who are currently in custody right now. And those cases are obviously going to take priority and work first. And then we'll, hopefully be in a position to move forward on that case, but it's going to be a little bit of time.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up. We talked about disparities in sentencing between African Americans and others. On that case, can you pledge to the citizens of Marion County that you are going to seek the same sentences and penalties that you would for a regular person doing similar things?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that the community wants to see and wants to make sure occurs, and so that's the biggest thing for all of us is we need to make sure that everybody's treated the same regardless of who they are, and that includes the outcome in any potential sentence or penalty.
Yeah, the reason why I asked that because, and I'm sure Milton Grimes would say the same thing. We've been both doing this for a very long time, and it seems that police officers, when they are prosecuted, in the rare cases they are prosecuted, always seem to skate by and get a sentence that is a whole lot less than one would get who was convicted of the same crime. That's why I asked that question. Milton, do you feel that way?
Absolutely. It seems as though the sentences are more lenient. The charges are less severe towards those officers. There's a lot of, as a friend of mine said, he represents police officers. Milton, when I walk into the courtroom with this client, he's presumed innocent. You walk into the courtroom with the average citizen, he's presumed guilty. So we start out on different playing fields, normally with the people, as opposed to when a police officer walks in to be judged. I have a question though, Ryan, and everybody here knows my little platform. In the state of Washington, the Supreme Court has recognized systemic racism and has recognized that they've made decisions in the past that was based on systemic racism and the lack of due process to African Americans. They've actually signed, I don't know if you've seen it or not, all 9 justices that we have been racist throughout the years, throughout the decades. And it's time for us to address it as judges and as lawyers and back up and treat minority citizens, especially African Americans, with more respect and compassion throughout the legal justice system. My question to you is that I look at judges and DAs now when I go on Zoom or the few times I go in court, are we going to deal with this case as we normally do? Or are we going to step back and say, we're dealing with a racist system that has put in place policies and procedures and rules that is so automatic for us to follow? Okay, this is your guy. We're going to offer him this kind of deal. He's got this much time, as opposed to let's give this person a second or third chance in life rather than putting another yoke around his neck in addition to his color. So has your office looked at the new view that a lot of us are looking at for this criminal justice system, and that is that the whole system has been permeated with racism and inequality, and not to help, but to hurt a people. As your office on a whole said, back up, we got to look at cases differently now.
Yes, and I think it starts with, number one, we can't be defensive about that issue, and we need to be willing to acknowledge it. I think that's the first part of it is we have to be open and say we haven't always gotten it right, and there have been times when the system as a whole has failed entire populations or groups of people. I think that's the first part of it. The second part of it, yeah, absolutely, in terms of going forward, is we need to be incredibly conscious of it, and we need to make sure that we are treating everybody fairly, but also making sure that we are using the data and the numbers to make those decisions, so we can, if there are disparities, we can point those out and correct them immediately. We are actually partnering with Stanford University on.
Ryan, I don't want to interrupt you, but you're joining Miss Banks, the Invisible Man role now. Could you get your angle on your camera a little bit different so we can see you?
Yeah. Yes, I see what you're saying.
I'm sorry, Ryan.
Yeah, and so we want to make sure that we're also using the data to say, hey, if these issues are continuing to occur, we need to be proactive to address them. We need to be thinking about it, and that goes from everything from how we screen cases to file cases to what plea offers we make. We need to go through that honest evaluation of ourselves right now. And so that's one of the things that we are undertaking as we speak. We've made some changes in our screening department from a personnel standpoint, and we're going to continue to build upon that just to make sure that the very thing that you just described does not continue to occur, and we don't perpetuate some of the past wrongs that have existed in the criminal justice system. But it starts with a recognition that, number one, those issues do exist. And so we've tried to be proactive on that point. We're going to continue to try to do that. I'm a big believer that if you have the stats and the numbers, that the public will appreciate it. I think the one thing when I made the marijuana decision, I got more support than I thought I would. And I think a lot of it was because here are the raw numbers. How do you reconcile these numbers? And so that's something that I want to continue to do as we make that evaluation of our conduct and our decisions in the prosecutor's office.
And one final question, and this is blowing up on our Facebook questions, Ryan. Here's the number one thing that's trending on our Facebook. The Facebook followers want to know this question. They want to know, what is the difference between a police officer just busting in the door on a no-knock warrant versus knock on the door saying police and allowing the person to come to the door? They said it all happens in a few seconds.
Well, but those few seconds, I mean, hopefully that will make the difference. And so, from legally, when you knock and announce, what you're supposed to do is knock, state who you are, police open up, and then you're supposed to give people an opportunity to respond. How long that opportunity is, that's open for some level of debate. But that's part of the conversation. And that can make a difference. And so I have seen cases when there is that knock and announce, when people are literally sitting there with their hands up. And so it does give people an opportunity to respond. If you just kick in a door and people aren't sure who it is, I think most people's instinct is to grab a gun if they have one available to them. If they hear a noise downstairs and they're upstairs and they don't know who that is, I think people's natural reaction is, what can I do to protect myself? But if you know who the person is and and they've announced themselves, hopefully that will alter the thought process somewhat. We've talked about, we've been fortunate here in Marion County. We haven't had a lot of those issues. And I think part of it is because the police do a good job of actually announcing themselves and saying, hey, it's the police at the door. And hopefully that will change people's thought processes and perspective. It's not a perfect solution, but it does help.
Well, I'd like to thank my special guest, Ryan Mears, and my superstar panel, Milton Grimes, John Sweeney, and Vanita Banks for coming on the show today. Thank you very much, Ryan. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you and our Facebook friends and our radio audience. I think the callers and on our Twitter continue to support us, and then you can share this show with others. Thank you very much. And don't forget, we have an election coming up in 52 days. Get out and vote. Vote. Thank you.
Thank you.